Hey everybody, it is Natalie from Power Moon Tarot, and welcome to this astrology reading of Edward Snowden's chart. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen share going, make sure I am live here for you guys. Yep, here I am. Let's make sure we've got good audio. All right, we do. And with that, I am going to share my screen. Okay. And let's go. Here we have it. Okay. Thank you guys for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and begin the reading. And for those of you that don't know who Edward Snowden is, Edward Snowden in 2013 decided he worked for NSA, for the National Security Agency, and he also worked for the CIA for a while too, but he ended up taking highly classified information from the NSA and then leaking that information to reporters from a location in Hong Kong regarding some our United States government spying on individual citizens. And because of that, he hasn't been able to return to the United States because he was charged with espionage. And he has since then been in Russia, and he gained permanent residency in Russia in the year 2020. And he lives there with his wife, who is also from the United States, and his two children. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at Edward Snowden. And for those of you that have seen the movie Snowden or seen the movie Citizen 4, perhaps you've seen those movies that came out about Edward Snowden's life. But to just kind of explain a little bit more before we start looking at the chart, I'm going to talk a little bit here about his life. So he was born on June 21, 1983. He's an American and naturalized Russian citizen who was a computer intelligence consultant and whistleblower who leaked highly classified information from the NSA in 2013 when he was an employee of NSA. His disclosures revealed numerous global surveillance programs, many run by the NSA, and Five Eyes intelligence alliance with the cooperation of telecommunication companies. Basically, they were spying on Americans, and just regular Americans, not people who were a threat. They were just and he exposed a lot of other things too besides the spying, but that was the big piece of it. And it prompted a cultural discussion around national security and individual privacy. And so interestingly, on May 20th, 2013, Snowden flew to Hong Kong, leaving his job at an NSA facility in Hawaii. And he revealed thousands of classified NSA documents to journalists Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and Barton Gellman. And Snowden came into international attention after stories based on the material appeared in The Guardian and The Washington Post. And Violet, hi, Violet. Thank you for being here. Thank you for saying hi. I just saw your message. Glad you're here. If you're here and you're into like government spies and international men of mystery and things like that, welcome in. And if you're familiar with, if you're a person that highly believes in privacy and that the government shouldn't be spying on its citizens, perhaps you are interested in this topic and in this particular chart. And it says on June 21st, 2013, on his birthday, actually, on his 30th birthday, the United States Department of Justice charged Snowden on 2 counts of violating the Espionage Act of 1970 or 1917 and theft of government property, following in which the Department of State revoked his passport at that time. So he was like a man without a country. And he lived in the Russian airport, the Russian International Airport, for 39 days while they were trying to sort out the situation. So in 2013, this was quite a big story. And he was originally trying to go to Ecuador, but he kind of got stuck in Russia. And then he just ended up living in Russia And it says Russian authorities observed his canceled passport, and he was restricted to the airport terminal for over 1 month. Russia later granted Snowden the right of asylum with an initial visa for residence for 1 year, which was repeatedly extended. In October of 2020, he was granted permanent residency in Russia. On September of 2022, Snowden was granted Russian citizenship by Vladimir Putin, and on December 9th, 2022, he swore the oath of allegiance. And yes, Violet, I guess you are into this topic, huh, of like governments. Yeah, and I think people who are, into topics of privacy and all of that are definitely. And for those of you that remember, like the WikiLeaks with Julian Assange, and there's been a number of whistleblowers and throughout history that have, whistleblowing is a concept of saying, I don't believe what this authority is doing, and me, the employee, or me, the person who's engaged with this authority, is going to blow the whistle on this particular agency and be like, you're doing shit you're not supposed to be doing. And, I'm calling you out on it. And so that is what we look at with Edward Snowden. And of course, he, at this point, still in 2024, he still is like a wanted criminal, and he can probably never come back to the United States. Because if he does come back, he's going to face trial and perhaps jail time. And so he lives in Russia now, which is interesting because he was very much like a rah-rah United States type of a person. And we're going to talk about his belief system and how it changed over time and what happened. And because he was very and he still is very pro-USA. According, to what he says and everything, it's not like he's all of a sudden aligned with Russia, but he is just pro citizens knowing what is going on from his point of view. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at his chart. Very intense chart. When I looked at this, I was like, whoa, what is going on here? And for those of you that have heavy planets in Gemini and Sagittarius, you may relate somewhat to this chart, as we are going to be talking a lot about that. Now, first things first, we just want to identify his ascendant. So he is a Gemini rising, 12 degrees Gemini rising. He has his sun in Gemini. Okay. He was born on June 21st, which is the summer solstice. So he was born on the longest day of the year, right before the sun switched into Cancer. So he's a sun in Gemini. He's an ascendant in Gemini. And he has a moon in Scorpio. Now, this moon in Scorpio is very interesting because the rest of his chart is pretty much air and fire, which tells me that he, especially in Gemini and Sagittarius, that his beliefs and his philosophy of life is very important to him, and that he's very passionate about the causes that he believes in, and he's very passionate about his way of thinking, and that he's very into standing up for what he believes in, and that he has a very passionate mind. And we can see that with, Mars in Gemini, Sun in Gemini, the North nodes in Gemini, his ascendant is in Gemini, and Mercury is actually in a conjunction with his ascendant in Gemini as well. So you've got and then all these Gemini planets are opposing Jupiter in Sagittarius, Uranus in Sagittarius, Neptune in Sagittarius, and there's the South Node as well. So that's a lot of fire and air. And we're looking at a person, especially with Mars Rahu conjunction, which I just talked about in Rudy Giuliani's chart, but he had it in the 12th house and he had it in Leo. So it was a different energy, but Mars Rahu combination, nerves of steel, courageous, wanting to do something to change the world. But I also think with the Mars Rahu conjunction, a lot of people may not know about Edward Snowden, is that originally he enrolled and enlisted in the army to be trained up in special forces in the army, and he did like the 18X enrollment in the army. And I think he was trying to be a Green Beret in the army, actually, special forces, but he had an injury that he wasn't able to continue on in the army. But you can see Mars Rahu in the first house, especially in Gemini. I'm ready to fight for my ideals and my thoughts and what I believe in. I'm ready to fight. Sign me up. I'm ready to go. And so we can see that energy in his chart right away with the Mars Rahu conjunction. So again, we're looking at a chart of somebody who's passionate and fiery and really believes in what he believes in. And then we've got this lone moon in Scorpio here. And, what's interesting about this moon in Scorpio is that, Edward Snowden, his big thing in life was privacy and protection of the individual. And, and he's quite like a secretive person himself. He doesn't like to reveal a lot of things about himself online. He doesn't like to talk about himself a lot. He's very secretive, and he values that scorpionic side of individual privacy and individual secrecy. And so he doesn't like the fact that, in order for him to feel safe, right? Because the moon is, how do we feel safe and nurtured? In order for him to feel safe and nurtured, he needs to feel like he's, like he can go under the radar if he wants to, that all his personal information about his family and his habits and who he is, like he doesn't want that out in the open, and he doesn't want the government doing that either. And so you can see that very private moon in Scorpio, like privacy is important to him. And, it is like a very emotional thing for him in a chart that is otherwise like air and fire and has more to do with the mind and the belief system of the individual. And so I find that very interesting as well, because the moon also shows what we're a protector over and what we're trying to protect or nurture. So I'm a protector of privacy. I'm a protector of, like, I don't want basically people's information out there. That isn't right. So you see that. And he also talked about, there's in some movies about him, they talked about how he could be at times jealous in his relationships. He could also be secretive, and and he called himself, in one of the interviews that he gave, he called himself an indoor cat. And he's like, I'm basically like an indoor cat. I don't like, and the sixth house, it's really funny because the sixth house is a house of pets. But if you had like a cat that was very secretive and like hid all the time and didn't want to be pet, and, you've got cats with different personalities, right? You've got cats that most of them are not like, well, I guess I have a friend of mine that has a cat that loves to be the center of attention, but just thinking of a very secretive cat that like hides all the time and doesn't really want to be bothered and is kind of an introvert, that's definitely his moon in Scorpio. And you can see that his ascendant is in a quincunx to this moon. And I think that that's really interesting because it says that there's something about his ascendant representing him, where he's coming from, who he is, in a quincunx or in a challenging relationship to his moon in Scorpio. And the moon is in fall in Scorpio, but a challenging relationship there. He can't go home. He can never go home. And he can't come home to the United States. He's going to forever be not being able to come home because of the information that he leaked and being charged with the Espionage Act. And the government tried to catch him for a long time as well. But like I said, he was in Russia. And when we talk about somebody who's very clever and is avoiding capture, and somebody who's like 10 steps ahead of people, we could really talk about Mercury, couldn't we? Because Mercury in astrology represents many different things. But one of the things that Mercury represents is like thieves and people who are like on the run, and people who take information and run with it. Mercury is the messenger god, and I'm going to talk about this multiple times over in this reading, but he's a very smart thief in the way that he took that information and left the country. And you can see his ascendant is in Gemini, and his Mercury is also in Gemini in a conjunction with his ascendant. So it's like double Mercury. And in astrology, Mercury rejoices in the first house. Mercury loves to be in the first house, thinking, talking, learning, discovering, curious, all of that, and highly intelligent. And we will talk about Edward Snowden and his incredible intelligence, scoring over 145 on IQ tests, like very, very intelligent, very, and also a very articulate individual as well, too. When we think about Mercury and the mind, also Mercury is associated with cunningness and being like 10 steps ahead. And so he's never been caught yet. And he does have permanent residency in Russia at this point, where the US can't really like take him, or capture him. But the US probably the government would have loved to capture him, I'm sure, and make an example out of him. Like, you will not steal secrets, and this type of thing. You will not be a whistleblower, all of that, which he ended up doing. And he ended up, because he was too quick on his toes to get caught up with them. And so that's a very mercurial thing, to be really quick on your toes and very cunning and be able to be like 10 steps ahead. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the reading. And oh my gosh, Robert, thank you so much. Robert says, I've been studying astrology for a couple of years, tropical and Vedic. And I must say your teachings are 100 on point. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Namaste. I've also studied Vedic as well, too, for about a year with my teacher. And so I do have a little bit of training in Vedic. Vedic is extremely complicated. It's very, very complicated. And trying to learn two systems is very challenging, too. And that's such a Mercury and Gemini thing. I personally have Mercury and Gemini in my own chart, and I find myself doing that all the time, like learning two things at the same time, or I can't slow down my thoughts, or things are going 100 miles an hour. And, Mercury is in domicile in Gemini. So Mercury is very strong in Gemini. And Edward Snowden definitely did use that to his advantage with his mercurial energy. And so we'll talk about that. And Violet says, hey, Robert. Yeah, I love that comment. If you're in the chat or you're watching this live with me, feel free to say hi, talk to each other. It's like, it's an open forum. So enjoy yourselves for sure. And and also too, his ascendant, like I mentioned, his ascendant and the ruler of his ascendant are right here in his first house. And they're both quincunx that moon in Scorpio. So there's this whole side where, again, he can't go home. And the moon has to do with being at home. I also feel like that moon in Scorpio is saying, I'm willing to be uncomfortable if I can accomplish my goals, and I'm willing to forego my own comfort. And it's interesting in a movie that he, when he was being interviewed, he talked about how people sometimes get too comfortable, and about how he, he's willing to kind of forego that if it's for his higher ideals and his higher beliefs. And we're definitely going to talk about big time in this reading. We're going to talk so much about his Mercury in Gemini opposition Jupiter, because this is a big thing for him. See his Mercury at 10 degrees Gemini opposite Jupiter in Sagittarius. Okay. So for my Gemini Sagittarius folks listening to this, you may resonate with some things here. And so the other thing I would say, the other thing I would say here too is that Robert says he has moon in Gemini. Yeah, so we're definitely going to we're going to talk about all the Gemini and all the Sagittarius stuff tonight. And So Edward Snowden, when I first looked at his chart, I was like, okay, this guy is like a purist when it comes to the mind. And, and Edward Snowden was like a computer engineer turned and like a computer genius. People said that he was a genius among geniuses because, people that work in computers and computer and cybersecurity, like in NASA and the CIA, like you have to have, of course, they've got a real high IQ and they're very, diligent, and they handle tons of information, right? Mercury and Gemini, tons of classified information, and they have to be really, really good at their jobs. And of course, Mercury does represent dexterity and skill. And so you've got that very strong, quick mind that is boom, boom on things right away. And I'm sure, and he mentioned multiple times about how his employers like loved him and were always fighting over him. And it's interesting because the 10th house, which would be our career, is ruled by Pisces. Of course, Jupiter is a ruler of Pisces, and you can see his career. Jupiter in Sagittarius is opposite his Mercury in Gemini. But he said his employers were always fighting over him because they always wanted him. It was like, this is a really smart dude who really gets it done. And so anyway, when we're talking about engineers, like engineers usually have two like categories they go into. One category is like the purists and the people who need everything to be like pure and aligned. And then the people who are very pragmatic. And it's like, well, even if it's not right, at the end of the day, it's better than doing this because the purists over here want to do something that's going to take so much time and it's not worth it just to be right, And so you can think about your own self and your own life too, right? Like, am I a purist? Am I more concerned like with something being right and the theory of it and something being totally pure? Or am I a pragmatic person who's like, well, it's not entirely right, but it gets the job done and we have to move on to other things anyway. And my argument would be that Edward Snowden is a purist and that he's a purist of the mind. And also when it comes to his beliefs as well, we can see Jupiter in Sagittarius talking about Jupiter has to do with our beliefs and what we believe to be true in life and how we see things, right? Our philosophical orientation towards life. And we can see like how important that is to him. You can see the ruler of his ascendant in the first house opposite his beliefs, but his beliefs also get challenged in his life too. And there's multiple times in his life where his beliefs are changed or are challenged, right? His beliefs are in a conjunction with Uranus right there too. He also has this Mercury in Gemini opposite Uranus, which Uranus is, highly genius as well too. So we have somebody with a very quick mind who's very genius and who is operating out of his convictions and his principles. And let's see what we want to move on to then. So I looked up this little, in case you guys are interested, I just did a little, there was a little chart. The purists want to hold the movement to very high standards. So Edward Snowden is like, if I work for the CIA and the NSA, I don't want to be spying on Americans in order to gain information. Like, we should be able to purify that information and only be spying on the bad guys. And we shouldn't be like breaking the law by spying on whatever. Okay. So he's saying they want things to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, they will attack and criticize those they see as heretics or hypocrites and those who are not on the true path. Now, the true path in life, you could say, would be like the Sagittarian path of life. Like, I am identifying my truth and my path and where I'm headed. And that's a very Sagittarius type of thing. So that's my argument for Edward Snowden being a purist. Now, a pragmatist may be more like, well, may say something like, well, that's great, but you're not going to get anything done. It's easy to be perfect on a mountaintop, but if you're to be amongst the marketplace with people, you have to meet people where you find them. So if you become too judgmental and too idealistic, you'll turn everyone off. And that's the pragmatic side of things. And many of us in life go through that. Like, do I be really perfect and have these high standards, or do I be a pragmatic person and kind of approach things this way? So I would argue that Edward Snowden is more of a purist, and that he's more motivated, Mercury opposite Jupiter, by his beliefs and his ideals. You can also see that his sun in Gemini is opposite Neptune as well. So talking about, two planets that have to do like with our idealism and having high ideals about something would both be Jupiter and Neptune. And you can see his Mercury is opposite Jupiter and his sun is opposite Neptune. And so you can see, okay, my beliefs in who I am in the world and my ideals are definitely going to get challenged. And they did for him big time. And so let's go ahead. Also, I think with, his ascendant in a conjunction with Mercury, he really identifies with his like thinking and his thought patterns. And he's like, even though he lives in Russia, he's like, I don't really live anywhere. I kind of like live on the internet. Like I'm like a talking head on the internet, which I think is very like Mercury and Gemini, opposite Uranus as well too. Like I'm a talking head that like lives on the internet. I am in Russia physically, but I don't like live here. I like live on the internet. So I thought that was pretty funny too. And I would also say, keep in mind when you're looking at a chart, keep in mind the angles in a chart. When I'm talking about the angles, I mean the angular houses, because they're very important. And the angular houses are house 1, house 4, house 7, and house 10. 7 has to do with partnerships and open enemies. The 10th house has to do with our career and our calling. And the 4th house has to do with our family and our foundation in life. And then the 1st house is us and our health and our vitality in life and who we are on a character level. And so when we're looking at a chart, we always need to really pay attention to the angles, house 1, 4, 7, and 10, because they're the most powerful houses in the chart, and they deserve our attention for sure. And when I look at the ruler of the 10th house of career, again, it's ruled by Pisces, which is, Jupiter rules Pisces. So you would say that the ruler of the 10th house is in the 7th house, represented by that Jupiter and Sagittarius. Also, the 7th house is ruled by that Jupiter too. And so you've got the 7th house and the 10th house ruled by this Jupiter and Sagittarius opposite Mercury and Gemini. Okay. So right away, it tells me that my beliefs, my ideals, where I'm aiming in life, all of that gets challenged and my mind gets changed, right? Mercury opposite Uranus, my mind is changed. And Gemini anyway is a sign of duality. And Gemini does see both sides to an issue. And I think as he got older and as he learned more about the government and the government's goals and things like that, his sense of naive, like believing in things kind of vanished and he saw things for what they were. And I also think his partner challenged his beliefs as well, too. Oftentimes when you see, and I've seen this in charts before, where the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 7th house representing my partner are in an opposition or square to one another. And they are both either represented by Mercury or Jupiter. And when I see that, it tells me that there may be conflicting beliefs with a person's partner. Like, I don't always agree with my partner politically. Like, we have political differences because Mercury and Gemini opposite Jupiter and Sagittarius could definitely be, especially when it rules the first house and the seventh house, could be me and my partner don't always see eye to eye on politics and things like that. And that was very true for Edward Snowden. He is now married to his long-term girlfriend, but when they met, Edward Snowden was all for like the Iraq war in response to 9/11. And his girlfriend was like, nah, like she was like, I'm on the opposite end of that. I don't believe there's weapons of mass destruction. I don't think the government has, positive idealistic goals and like freeing people from oppression. I think they're trying to get oil. So these two were kind of, at each other a little bit. And when they met, and eventually his girlfriend actually, and now wife, like changed him in a way. And you can see how the ruler of the seventh house is in a conjunction with Uranus. And, she's changed him in a way, like his thinking and the way that he looks at things. And they have had their differences and their political differences over the years, but they've somehow managed to stay together. And it's interesting because like in reading different news stories about their relationship, the press has said that it's an attraction of opposites, which is really interesting to me because Edward Snowden is in a direct opposition to his partner. So even the news is calling it out and being like, this is a relationship of opposites. And truly it was when they met, particularly way different belief structures. Edward Snowden came from a family that had all worked in government. Like his mom works in government, his dad does, his sister does, his grandfather did. Like they all work in different areas of the federal government. And he had a particular idea about what he needed to do after 9/11 happened. And we will talk a little bit about 9/11 because September 11th, because it does integrate with this chart. So we will talk a little bit more about that later. And I do think 9/11 may have radicalized him a little bit to join the army and participate in all of that. And Violet is saying, I know nothing about horoscope teaching, too complex for me, though, listening to truth seekers. So yeah, to truth seekers, right? And that is very much like a Sagittarius thing and a Gemini thing, I feel both, because they're opposite signs. Gemini and Sagittarius are opposite signs. And part of their like goal and initiative is to be curious and to seek the truth. And Edward Snowden definitely had that within him too. So let's go ahead and let's see. I want to start with talking about, I want to read you guys a couple of quotes from Edward Snowden, which I think are really evident in his chart. There's a quote where he says, if my priority was safety, I would be in the NSA today spying on you. If my priority was safety. Now, again, his ascendant is in a quincunx to this moon, and the moon definitely in our chart has to do with like feeling safe and being safe. And he's like, if my priority in life was safety and security, I would have like stayed in the NSA and continued to spy on people, but that's not my priority in life. And again, moon quincunx the ascendant. So I think that is a very interesting comment that he made there. And he did say, the things I believe in are worth the risk. Okay. So take a look at this. The things I believe in are worth the risk. We have Mercury in Gemini. Okay. And we have it opposite Jupiter. Okay. The things I believe in, Jupiter and Sagittarius, right? The things I believe in are worth the risk in a conjunction with Uranus. Risky things, different things, doing something unexpected. Okay. The things I believe in are important to me. And I feel like this Mercury Jupiter opposition in his chart from his first house to his seventh house is just, it's highly, highly important to him. Highly, highly, like what he believes in and what he's trying to do. And some people are like that in life. They're very motivated by their beliefs and what they perceive as the truth, and they're willing to stand up for that, and they're willing to even die for it in some cases, and that's a very Sagittarius type of a thing. And Robert says astrology gives you the insights on a personal level and finds it fascinating. I know the chart can look intimidating, but learning the basics have helped me. I still turn to them. Yeah, the very basics, right? About I think sometimes we get overly complicated in astrology. This chart is very complicated too. I will just say this is a highly complex chart. But, one thing I really drilled on in is Gemini and Sagittarius, right? Because he has such a huge smattering of planets in both. And I think if you just keep in mind the differences between Gemini and Sagittarius, you start to see some of these things in his chart. And so I totally agree with you, Robert, on the basics and going back to the basics. And anyway, so let's see. And he said, it's not enough to believe, you have to stand up for something. And I think that's very much his Mars Rahu in the first house, right? Because a lot of people can be evangelists for a cause, right? And, Jupiter in Sagittarius, or Sagittarius in general, could definitely be evangelizing for a particular cause. And, and how his thinking, Mercury and Gemini, how his thinking and his handling of duality is influenced by that evangelizing. And whether we all know it or not, from the moment we are born, we are being evangelized too. Our environment is showing us things that we need to believe. Our family is showing us things we need to believe. And it forms us as an individual. But over time, those beliefs are challenged. And particularly for some people, and I would argue for him, this is a very big issue for him, because it is so personal to him. Mercury is in a conjunction with his ascendant, and they are opposite that Jupiter in Sagittarius. And it's with Uranus too. And Uranus is saying, okay, we're doing something different. Okay. This isn't going to be what we thought it was going to be. This is going to be something different. And for him, it's not just about getting on his pulpit and preaching about what he thinks it should be, which is, a very Sagittarian thing to do, but it's also about, doing something in response to that. And with the Mars North Node being in conjunction there, I think, especially with the sun too, is courage and I am willing to fight for my beliefs. Okay. Mars and Gemini. I am ready to the information that I'm learning is pissing me off, and I'm willing to stand up for that and fight for that. And Sun opposite Neptune, I don't care if I sacrifice. And keep in mind, the word for Neptune is sacrifice. So I don't care if I have to sacrifice myself, the Sun, right? The Sun in Gemini. I don't care if I have to sacrifice myself and who I am. I am taking action because this is what I believe, and it's important. And I think that's, a big part also of why he joined the military after 9/11, because it's I can't just sit here spouting off what I think I should be doing. I need to take action. I need to Mars Rahu, I need to do something about this. I can't just sit here and do nothing. And anyway, and so I'm glad, Violet, hard moons, etc., houses, I'm lost. Oh, Violet, I know. It's okay. It's all right, my dear. I know it's a lot of information. And I think, astrology can also be information overload. And I am definitely guilty of information overload. And it is something I've been trying to control my whole life, honestly, to tell you guys the truth. I have Mercury square Mars in my chart. I'm always on overdrive, and I'm always thinking. And part of one of my New Year's resolutions is to be less complicated, to present things. And actually, I want to teach more this year too. And so part of teaching is like slowing down and really like, helping people understand things. And so I want to do that as well too. So if I'm going too fast or you're like, I have no clue what you meant by that, you can leave me a comment and I'll take it to heart. And yeah. So interestingly, Edward Snowden dropped out of high school. And what I find fascinating when we look at the third house in astrology, which is right here, this is the third house, down here, I'm just circling it. That's the third house. The ruler of the third house is the sun, and it's opposite this Neptune. So he got mono when he was in school. And I mentioned the third house because the third house has to do with like early education and early learning. So he got mono, which the sun opposite Neptune can also indicate somebody who has like a weaker vitality. Not always, but sometimes. And particularly for him when it came to school, which is represented by the third house and the ninth house, but particularly early education being associated with the third house, he got mono when he was in high school and he missed like a ton of high school, and he ended up dropping out of high school because he was very sick and ill. And so he ended up like teaching, because he dropped out when he was like 15. From the time he was like 16 to 20, he basically was like teaching himself everything he could learn about computers. And like being able to teach yourself something is a very mercurial thing type of two. It's like he taught himself, he's pretty much self-taught computer wise. And he does have that Mercury opposite Uranus too. So he's very much like in Sagittarius. So he's very much a maverick of the mind. And, kind of like teaching himself is very interesting and curious. Then he got his GED, took some online community college, and got hired by the CIA. And he was one of the most like brilliant people that worked there. And he was very, very young. And so he kind of breaks those stereotypes of, you have to go to this big school and you have to, you can't get a GED. You have to go to this crazy big school. And he's actually like very self-taught, which I found interesting as well too, that he's self-taught and an invention of himself. Mercury opposite Uranus, his ascendant opposite Uranus, self-taught and an invention of himself. And I will also say that there were some people that talked about him. And, one more quality of like Gemini Sagittarius, I would say, is, wanting to enlighten other people or wanting to teach other people, but also can be condescending. And some people he worked with and people from his past talked about how he could be condescending at times. And I really think that ascendant Mercury conjunction in Gemini, like being so smart like he was, being so intelligent like he was, and having a very fast and a quick mind, but opposite Jupiter, like this is the right way to think, this is the right way to go. And if you don't go that way, you're dumb, and kind of condescending to people a little bit. So he did have that side of him. And that is a thing, I think, with Sagittarius, maybe on some of the more like negative qualities that maybe we'd want to not embrace, being like Sagittarius energy. Yeah, Robert says he didn't know that Snowden dropped out of school. I thought he was like in MIT. No, he dropped out because he got sick, like we mentioned, and he just did his own thing. And he spent like 5 years just scouring the internet and becoming like a computer genius from like, I think it was like 1996 to 2001. And he was self-taught. And again, and here's another thing. I wonder if he was bored in school as well. I mean, he did get really sick. He missed like 9 months of school because he got mono. We talked about the ruler of the third house opposite Neptune. Like, getting mono and being sick for like 9 months is very much like a Neptunian type of a thing. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't feel well. Like, I have no energy. But I also wondered if like school was just really boring to him because again, Mars in Gemini, Mercury in Gemini, ascendant in Gemini, like, was he just quick? And did he just get bored easily too? Because, some people, they have such a fast, quick mind and they're very like, they have a high IQ. So they get bored. And I do think, impatience or maybe getting bored may be a thing, especially with Mars and Gemini in the first house, conjunction Rahu. It's like, I'm bored. I need to learn more. I need to do more. Even at like the CIA, he was like writing new computer programs and like blowing everyone out of the water with his like raw intelligence. And so, I mean, wow, it's unbelievable. Like, how smart this guy was. But like I said, he also we'll talk more about his problems with his beliefs and like how he couldn't ignore like how he was offended by what hypocrites and liars our government was being. And I think that is very like Sagittarius, like on the positive side of Sagittarius, it's like, this is very offensive type of energy. Okay. And DG, welcome, DG. DG says, I can relate to teaching myself at school because of illness. I ended up working better self-taught because it's how I learned to learn. Yeah, right. And everybody learns differently. And, also I will say too that Edward Snowden has Venus in Leo in his third house of learning and early education. Early education is the third house and higher education, college is the ninth house. But early education, Venus is the most positive planet in this chart because it's a night chart. So Venus becomes the most positive planet, Saturn becomes the most negative, but he does have Venus in Leo in that third house, which like sweetens the deal for him. And he's a very independent learner. And DG, I can see why you did that too. And I'm kind of the same way too. I kind of prefer to learn on my own sometimes. With the exception of like, there's certain subjects I want to study with certain people, but other than that, I kind of do my own thing too. So I get you on that. And and he also, like I told you guys, he said, our comfort is our enemy. And again, we have the ascendant quincunx that moon, the moon representing the comfort. Our comfort is our enemy. I also want you guys to pay attention to this Sun in Gemini trine Saturn and Pluto in Libra. And to me, Sun trine Saturn and Pluto conjunction talks of a person who is very good at going through tough situations and toughing it out. And he was in the military and he broke 2 of his legs and they ended up discharging him because he broke his legs. He was on the run. He was like an international, fugitive for a long time. Like, this is a person who can tolerate challenging situations and come through them. Sun trine Saturn Pluto conjunction. Now, later on in the reading, we're going to talk about Saturn Pluto cycles, and we're going to talk about Saturn Pluto in general, because as you can see here, the 2 are in a conjunction. And Edward Snowden was born in 1983. And everyone who was born in 1982, 1983 timeframe has a Saturn Pluto conjunction in their chart. And it's interesting because Saturn Pluto goes like 30 years. It's like a 30 plus year cycle of Saturn and Pluto in a conjunction, Saturn and Pluto squaring each other, opposing each other, and then coming back to a conjunction. So we're going to talk more about that Saturn Pluto thing. And for those of you who were born around 1982 or 1983, this should be a very interesting topic for you guys because you all have that in your chart if you were born at that time. But we will get to that in a little bit. So let's go ahead and we talked about, okay. So another thing, I want to read you another quote that, speaking of Saturn, Pluto, I want to read you another quote by Edward Snowden. His quote was, "My biggest fear is nothing will change." And I think that's very Saturn Pluto, because Saturn is like things crystallizing and staying the same. And Pluto is, of course, deep, enduring change. And his biggest fear, Saturn Pluto, is that things will not change and society will change, will stay the same. And like maybe that everything he did was for nothing. And maybe that has been a fear of his too. But before we move on to talking more about, because I'm going to give you guys a fun little talk tonight about Hermes, Mercury being the thief in mythology. But before I do that, I just want to break down the seventh house a little bit here, because there are so many planets here in his seventh house. And of course, the seventh house has to do with partnerships, and were a big part of Edward Snowden's life. And he had to leave his partner behind and not tell her anything that was going on in order to protect her. So she wouldn't also be charged with espionage as well. But that's a whole other story we'll get into in a little bit. But I also just want to refresh your guys' memory on like the seventh house being the house of open enemies. And the 12th house is, of course, associated with hidden enemies and the things that we don't see. It's behind it's behind the first house. So it is talking about things that are hidden, versus the seventh house is about open enemies. And it's about people that we're in direct conflict with, or people that are opposite to us, or the forces that oppose us that we actually know about. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And, his career, 10th house, the ruler of the 10th house is in his house of open enemies, opposing his Mercury in Gemini, which Mercury rules his ascendant. So it's like it's opposing him. And so his career is opposing him in the seventh house of open enemies. Let's think about that for a little bit. And the seventh house represents all enemies that are identifiable. And the seventh house signifies opposing forces and those who invade our territory and act against us openly. Okay. And the seventh house, like in horary astrology, which is another branch of astrology, represents fugitives, runaways, known criminals at large, which, Edward Snowden was a known criminal at large for a while. And the seventh house represents the person at the opposite side to the process, like they're opposite to us because we're in our first house. Okay. And so the seventh house also represents outlaws and fugitives who are not imprisoned, because the 12th house represents prisoners and people, who are in prison is one of the associations with the 12th house, where the seventh house represents fugitives on the run, people who are not imprisoned and haven't been caught, but they are known enemies. And so I find that energy interesting because the seventh house is an angular house. It is a strong and powerful house, but in the seventh house, we may have dangerous situations that attack our safety because it represents an opposition to the ascendant. Okay. So everything in the seventh house, you could say, is opposing the ascendant. And so it represents a situation that could become dangerous, right? And when we look at Mercury opposite Jupiter, it's like, because of my beliefs, my career, ruler of the 10th house, becomes like a dangerous thing for me and it opposes me. And Yeah, my career, ruler of the 10th house, due to my disharmony with my beliefs, Mercury opposite Jupiter, it brings me into a dangerous place, which, as we talked about, the seventh house can represent a dangerous place and a place of open enemies. It also does represent our partnerships. And I talked about how Jupiter, the ruler of the seventh house, is also opposing Edward Snowden, the ruler of his ascendant, which is saying me and my partner our political beliefs are different and we're clashing on things, which we already spoke about. And that is true. And yeah, so interestingly, let's go ahead and talk about. So now that we've talked a little bit about the seventh house and that these, his career is showing up in the seventh house, his partner is in the seventh house, his partner is represented by Jupiter in Sagittarius and is opposing him. So it's like me and my partner are split up because my beliefs are putting me in a place where we can't be together. And I think that that's very interesting because he was separated from his partner. He was in love with her and they were in love with each other and had been together for years, but he had to leave Hawaii without her. He couldn't tell her where he was going. And because he didn't want to expose her to what was going on. And he had to leave her without saying goodbye, really. And the sadness and the pain that she went through as a result of that. And we can also see Neptune in the South Node in the seventh house of partner here, which to me also speaks to her sadness and her pain. And she wrote an Instagram post about, crying on her keyboard and not being able to say goodbye and in a proper way. And because he told her he was just going on a work trip, he didn't tell her I'm leaving and I'll never be able to return because this is what I'm doing. And, the pain and the sadness, she said after he left her alone in Hawaii and was in Hong Kong, never to return, that she felt lost and confused. And she felt so sad and broken down by it. And she wondered, will I ever see him again? This is the love of my life. And it's interesting because of his beliefs, he really put her in a tough position as well. And I really see that as this Neptune South Node conjunction in the seventh house of partnership is because of my beliefs in Sagittarius, right? Because of my beliefs, my partner is suffering too, is because of the sacrifice that I made. Sun opposite Neptune, my partner is suffering right along with me. And that's it to me. When I saw that Neptune conjunction in K2 in the seventh house of partnership, it just made me have a lot of empathy for her because I thought, my God, they'd been together for a really long time. I wonder, I think they met in their 20s, but they'd been together for a long time. Maybe it was high school. I don't know. But I mean, they loved each other dearly. And, just he's gone and there's nothing. To me, I was oh my God, when I heard that, it just hit me right in the heart. I can't imagine how scared you would be and how confused you would be about what's going on. And I wanted to show you, there's a picture of Edward Snowden with his girlfriend, the one he left in Hawaii. Now they're married and she moved to Russia for him. And they have 2 kids together, but her name is Lindsay Mills. And there they are together in Russia. And, you look at him and it's just so interesting looking at his face. A guy who sacrificed so much for what he believed in. And there he is with his girlfriend. At least she was able to join him in Russia. And there they are. Look at this, you guys. There they are with their first child, who was born in Russia, is a Russian citizen. And they're kissing there. And they have their child. But remember, Edward Snowden is hugely into privacy. And he doesn't want because Lindsay, his wife, Lindsay, is way more open about posting pictures and things like that. He is not. He's very privacy, 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 moon in Scorpio. But this picture, they put like this emoji over the face of their child because I'm guessing probably Edward Snowden insisted to his wife, like, I don't want my child's face on the internet. And so every picture of their two boys, they have two boys, I think one boy, I think they have two boys, but in all pictures of their children, their faces are hidden, or they have like weird emojis covering up the faces of their children. And I think that's really interesting with his moon in Scorpio. And it made me think of also Ben Affleck, the actor, who also has moon in Scorpio. And he is so protective of his children. He does not want them photographed. He actually tried to pass legislation saying like the paparazzi doesn't have the right to record like children's faces. I think it went through. I don't remember, but like, he is very like Ben Affleck, the actor, he has moon in Scorpio in his fifth house of children. And he is just like a hawk on that. He's like, don't photograph my children. I don't want my children's faces out there. Very protective, privacy. And Edward Snowden is also like that too. Like he's very much like privacy. I don't want pictures of my children out there on the internet. And his wife is completely different. His wife is represented by Jupiter in Sagittarius, and she lives her life like an open book. And it's so funny in some of the news articles I was reading about her, because I mean, Jupiter in Sagittarius is like an open book, like, yeah, I'll go here, I'll go there, like I'll share whatever I have to share. I'm an open book. And Edward Snowden is like, don't share that. Don't post that. Don't do that. Okay. And so you see again these clashes maybe in their beliefs or how they're total opposites. He's like an introverted, moon in Scorpio, up in his head, ascendant with Mercury. But his wife, which is represented by Jupiter in Sagittarius, opposite to him, is like, let's live life, let's post photos, let's go on Instagram. And she called herself a adventurous pole dancing superhero. And I was like, that's very Jupiter in Sagittarius. And so I thought that was really interesting about her. And here's a picture of her from like online. That's his wife, who he's now with in Russia, who moved to Russia for him. But she's around a pole there. But she's like, she's into pole dancing. She's into traveling. And I found out that she's a Pisces, which, Pisces is ruled by Jupiter anyway. So she's like a total Jupiterian, like live, laugh, and love, right? And he's like secretive, NSA guy. So you couldn't find two more people who were like more different, but yet opposites attract. And in this case, they actually do stick together. And DG says, Violet says he did. Okay, Robert has to head out. Yep. And let's see what else. Same self-thought. I wonder if it's a Mercury and Gemini thing, self-taught. DJ says, oh, yay. I have to take care, Robert. Okay, Robert, have a good night, my friend. And Violet says he did what was right at a cost risk of what was the right thing to do. He's a better human than most, and he would turn when most would turn a blind eye. Yeah, very much a lot of personal sacrifice. And we see the Sun in Gemini opposite Neptune and Sagittarius, like, I will take this information, Sun in Gemini. I personally will take this information and get it to where it needs to be because of what I believe in. Okay, Neptune and Sagittarius, but the sacrifice, right? Sun opposite Neptune, the sacrifice that he has had to make for that. And DG says Ben Affleck and J-Lo's relationship would make for an interesting astrological chart. Yeah, it's funny because I did Ben Affleck's chart, but I didn't do hers yet. And Violet says maybe her way helping them stay safe has people know they can't just disappear. Yeah, I think so too, Violet. That's a very interesting comment, like about how his wife is like out there with everything. And it's like, okay, we can't just like, if we disappear, then you'll know we're gone because I'm not like posting anything. I think that's a very interesting comment as well. Okay. So let's look at Mercury in more detail now that I've kind of went over some of that information. Let's look at Mercury in Gemini conjunction his ascendant in Gemini. Now, something I need to show you guys while I talk about this, and we're going to do a little tarot and astrology together right now, is I need to show you guys the wonderful, amazing magician. Okay, so for those of you that are familiar with tarot, the magician in the tarot does get associated with Mercury, with the planet Mercury. And so as I'm reading you guys this little, keep in mind, Edward Snowden has his ascendant with a conjunction of Mercury and Gemini. Okay, so keep that in your mind and realize that the magician in the tarot is associated with Mercury. So let me talk to you guys a little bit about Mercury the thief, because I think this is very interesting. So Mercury, since Mercury was, or Hermes, as we could also call Mercury, Hermes is another name for Mercury, like Hermes or Mercury as a thief. And it's kind of an interesting thing. So let me share this with you guys. Remember in mythology that Mercury was as a baby, like when we read the mythology of Mercury, Mercury as a baby was trying to find ways to get out of his cradle and like escaped out of his cradle at a very early age, and then went to go steal a bunch of oxen from another god. And so you can see why Mercury is getting associated with like thieves and people doing like cunning kind of thing. And like, you know, babies are funny. Like if you notice very mercurial babies, like some babies are just kind of like troublemakers from the very beginning. Like they're always trying to escape their cradle. They're always trying to get out of their playpen. Like, you know, they're just little escape artists. And that is very mercurial. And if you think about like, it's probably because they're bored and they need mental stimulation, or they're already like very smart and trying to figure things out. And also when you think about like magicians in general, like a lot of them are escape artists. And it kind of reminds me of that movie, like Catch Me If You Can. Do you guys remember that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where he's like, you know, like doing stuff and like running all over the place and like writing fake checks? And, you know, that whole movie, Catch Me If You Can, is very mercurial. Now, keep in mind, Mercury has like the feet that fly and has like, you know, wings on the sandals of his feet. And Mercury is the messenger god charged with carrying information. And so really think about that with Edward Snowden and how he has the ascendant conjunction Mercury in Gemini. His ascendant in Gemini conjunction Mercury in Gemini. So let me read you guys a little bit about Let me read you guys a little bit about Mercury the thief. So Mercury has to do with trade, travel, and theft. Okay, tricky Mercury. And Mercury has to do with transition, change of affiliation, or change of residences. Mercury is the god of borders and the ruler of exchange, trade and exchange. And Mercury also represents technical art and professional secrets or magic. Okay, the magician and Mercury. Keep your eye on the magician card there. Okay, and Mercury represents like mental skill and cunning. Okay, and in the tarot, the magician is called the intelligence of transparency and the ability to like see through things and get to the answer quickly. And Mercury also has to do, the magician also has to do with like watchful awareness of things that are happening in your environment around you. That's very much like a magician thing. And I also think with the magician in the tarot, the ability to handle complex situations and complex problems and distill them down into something manageable. And also the magician representing talent in multiple different areas. Like I know a woman, a friend of mine who's actually, she's more of an acquaintance, but she's friends with a good friend of mine. And she is a tarot reader, an astrologer, and a good one, both a good one. And she is a classically trained Jungian psychologist, and she is known, and she is a like expert dream analyzer. Like she also teaches like interpretive dance, and she does, I mean, she has so many talents and skills, and it's like, wow, this lady, like, she does everything. And you know, the magician is looking at the pentacle, the cup, the sword, and the wand right here, and is saying, what do I want to pick up and use today? And I have all these things at my fingertips that I can use, right? And that's very mercurial, to have all these different skills and talents that you can employ at different moments whenever you need them. And I would say that's very much like Edward Snowden, highly intelligent. You know, he had an IQ over 145, as I mentioned, very articulate, also very cunning, lots of access to, you know, to data and to manipulate data, which is very mercurial. And let's not forget that Edward Snowden stole information. Like he stole information and took it across borders. All right. Mercury and Gemini, opposite Jupiter and Sagittarius. I'm stealing information and I'm taking it over borders, and I'm taking it to other countries, right? Opposite Jupiter and Sagittarius, which is, you know, other countries, travel, etc. And so you can see like his chart was like, who else could pull this off except for Edward Snowden, especially with his Mars Rahu conjunction in Gemini, you know, balls of steel, nerves of steel. He walked out of the NSA with like, you know, in a little chip with like 200,000 pages of information. Like that's an insane amount of information. Mercury opposite Jupiter, an insane amount of information, like Jupiter being like the planet of big and like blowing things up. So it's like, wow, he walked out of that, you know, facility with insane amounts of information and stole it and brought it to another country, which I think is very much, you know, Mercury opposite, Mercury and Gemini opposite Jupiter and Sagittarius. And so, yeah, he escaped with a ton of information to give to other people. And yeah, Mercury as the thief. And Mercury in Greek mythology is also in charge of protecting travelers. So he's traveling with that information. And I mean, he was in a very, very sensitive place, because if he would have been caught, he would have been charged with espionage and none of those documents would have gotten out there. And so, I mean, whoa, talk about sensitive, like, and Mercury being a protector and in charge of protecting travelers. Now, it's so funny when I started doing this chart that I just started having an urge to like read Greek mythology again. And as I like, it's so funny because like a few hours later, after I was done reading Greek mythology, I found an article that said that Edward Snowden, like growing up, he was never a partier. He never liked to party, right? We have Sun trine Saturn and Pluto in the fifth house, like two heavyweights in his fifth house of, you know, if we're talking about does somebody like to party, we'd look at their fifth house probably. And because it is the house of pleasure and partying. And like, you know, he has Saturn, Pluto. So he doesn't, in his fifth house, he doesn't like to party. He's not into that. But he did say he liked to read a lot of like Greek mythology and mythology in general when he was growing up. And so I just found that so funny because I was like, all of a sudden became obsessed with reading Greek mythology as I was like looking at his chart, and then later found out he loved reading Greek mythology too, which sometimes as an astrologer, when you're doing somebody's chart, it's like you become them sometimes, or you start thinking like them, or you start absorbing the energy in their chart. interesting phenomena for those of you astrologers out there who've had that happen. And that is straight up magic, right? With the magician, that is magic right there. Like you start absorbing the energy of the chart. And it's like, whoa, okay, where are we going? But anyway, so Mercury was associated with thieves as well as liars. So he had to turn and look people in the eye and lie to them and be like, "Oh, I'm just leaving because of my health issues." And that's why I'm taking time off. Like none of them knew what was happening. So he had to lie to them and steal that information. It also guides souls into the underworld and has great insight. Mercury equals mischievous, which equals magician. And as I mentioned in mythology, Mercury escaped his cradle from a very early age and went to steal other gods' oxen. And, Mercury is really known for like escaping with secrets to tell other people. Like that is definitely a mercurial thing. And if you weren't fully convinced yet of his like Mercury, like taking information and thieving it and leaving, you can see that his Mercury is also at an opposition to Uranus. And Uranus has, according to famed astrologer Richard Tarnas, Uranus has oftentimes been associated with Prometheus, who is another god who Prometheus defied the Olympian gods, defied Zeus, defied the Olympian gods, and stole fire from the gods and then gave it to humanity in the form of knowledge, and was punished by Zeus and chained to a rock to eat his liver out. So that makes Uranus a champion of human civilization against authority, non-hierarchical sharing of information via technology. Like that is a very Uranian thing to do. And, like Uranus and Sagittarius, it's my belief that people should have this information. And so again, talking about, the Uranus archetype, and a lot of people will say that, Uranus is like the higher octave of Mercury anyway, but that Uranus has this attitude of, I'm stealing fire from the gods in order to give it to my peers, or I'm giving it to humanity, right? And Edward Snowden's like, I'm stealing this information and I'm giving it back to reporters so that they can share it with everybody and then make their own decisions about, what they want. My laptop is dying, so everybody hold 1 minute and let me plug it in. Love it when that happens. Just kidding. And anyway, so that is interesting because the whole Prometheus energy and Mercury being a thief, and then he has Mercury opposite Uranus. Another kind of like, interesting thing about Uranus, about the Mercury opposite Uranus, like when we were watching, my boyfriend and I were watching the documentary long before I did his chart, like long before I did it or had even seen it. And in the documentary about him, they made a movie about his life and what he did. At one point in the movie, he starts having epileptic seizures. And seizures are very like, because he had never had them before, he had his first attack of a seizure. He was at his apartment with his girlfriend and he started like seizing and shaking, and he's on the floor having an epileptic seizure. And evidently his mother had seizures as well, but this was right before he took that data and left the country. But he got diagnosed with epilepsy. And it was interesting because my boyfriend and I were watching the movie, and he turned and he looked to me and he says, we both love astrology, but he turned to look at me and said, "Oh, he has seizures. Like, what do you think? Like, where does that come from in his chart?" And I was like, I hadn't even seen his chart, mind you, at the time, but I was like, Mercury Uranus. Like he has to have something with Mercury Uranus, because if we look at like the nervous system and the brain and the electricity and the surges that are happening, it's so very Mercury Uranus. And then I pulled up his chart and I was like, oh my God, wouldn't you know, he has Mercury in Gemini, which of course, you know, Gemini rules the nervous system, opposite Uranus, which does have to do with that, you know, mind, electricity, epilepsy, all of that shock kind of thing going on. And I was like, yeah, he has Mercury opposite Uranus and he does have epilepsy. So I found that interesting as well, too, with the Mercury opposite Uranus, but also his, you know, intention to kind of be rebellious with information and steal fire from the gods and give it to the rest of humanity. Like, steal fire from the ruling elite and then give it to everyone else and say, these people are watching you and they're surveilling you. Moon and Scorpio, they're watching you, they're surveilling you, and it's not right. And so I find that really interesting with the whole Prometheus and things like that. Also, so as we talk about Jupiter, you know, his Mercury, we talked in length about Mercury being the thief and the thief archetype opposite this Jupiter in Sagittarius. Now, when we talk about Jupiter in particular and Jupiter in Sagittarius, because Jupiter is in domicile in Sagittarius and Jupiter loves to be in Sagittarius. But Jupiter, when we're thinking about when we're thinking about morals and ethics and having a good, like, moral, ethical framework or in life, that definitely is Jupiter. So Jupiter has to do with like making the right choices and making the right moral choices, which lead to good things in your life. That is like the Jupiter framework. Jupiter also has to do with, like, especially in Sagittarius, has to do with our beliefs and the way that we view the world. Now, as I mentioned before, Edward Snowden's beliefs really did matter to him. As a result of September 11th, he went and enlisted in the Army into special forces. And so, you know, he was one of those people that he believed like the Iraq war was, like many of us, like, you know, we needed to, like, you know, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We need to go do something about it. And because of 9/11, a lot of people, you know, joined the military because of all of that and wanted to help. And that was really like him acting on his beliefs, him putting where his money where his mouth is. But then later on, and then after that, after he got discharged from the military because he had an injury, he basically went to go work for the CIA to catch the bad guys and try to outwit the bad guys and design computer programs, you know, Mercury and Gemini opposite Uranus, like design computer programs that are really high tech to catch those bad guys. But as he is working at these agencies, his beliefs start to unravel and he starts to realize, oh my gosh, like, the head of the NSA just lied to Congress on TV. Like, he's saying things that I know we're doing, Mercury and Gemini, I know we're doing that, but he's lying to the American people and saying we're not doing that. And then he just started to see all this hypocrisy, you know, and Jupiter in Sagittarius opposite Mercury in Gemini, like, you know, he started to have his beliefs challenged and he started to see the hypocrisy in things. And also his girlfriend was like, you know, didn't believe in that war. And she's like, well, it's not like I don't support the troops. I don't think the reason is valid. And so he had these, like, you know, he had things going on at work that were showing him like, we're not the good guys that, like, I thought that we were. And he also had this whole thing of like, you know, my girlfriend also has these views as well. And he was seeing how people in like the CIA were like getting people purposely in trouble in order to blackmail them into being informants. And he's like, wait, like, why are we doing that? Why are we accusing innocent people or framing innocent people just in order to get information? Like, it started to not resonate, like everything piled up and wasn't resonating with him anymore, which created a huge crisis in his belief system of like, wait, this isn't right. Like, I don't agree. And, we really see that with the opposition to Jupiter. Like, my beliefs are being challenged. And with the conjunction to Uranus, my beliefs are actually changing, in fact. And so I find that very interesting because, Jupiter really talks about how, especially in Sagittarius, talks about how my core beliefs support me or they don't. Do my core beliefs support me or do they not? And in his situation, being in an opposition to the ruler of his ascendant, it's like my core beliefs aren't supporting me and they need to change. Conjunction Uranus. And so I find that very interesting, like there being a challenge with the opposition to his beliefs and to what he believes in. Now, let's go ahead and so I think we really hit on, I also talked about how, and how, it's interesting because people say in the media say that he gave an education to the American people on how our civil liberties are being undermined. And, giving an education on something is very Mercury and Gemini opposite Jupiter and Sagittarius. But, you can see that the Jupiter in Sagittarius also rules his 10th house of career. So it's like, because I challenged my belief system, my career is greatly changed, conjunction Uranus, because of that. And the bottom kind of falls out because his beliefs are challenged in that way. And again, he also has this sun opposite Neptune, which, I think can be a little bit naive. He has Neptune in Sagittarius. And it's like, and interestingly, when you look at, and I haven't talked much about the concept of declination, but it's how two planets line up either conjunction or opposing each other based on the ecliptic. And like, what's interesting when you look at the grid and where it shows you like these little lines here, parallel lines or contraparallel with the line across it, show us where planets are making an aspect together because of their declination. And you can see his ascendant is also contraparallel Neptune. So I just think, and he has his sun opposite Neptune, Mars opposite Neptune, willing to take action, willing to sacrifice himself in order to help others. And that Neptune idealism, especially in Sagittarius of, I'm willing to, I see the greater picture and I see the greater purpose in this. So I am willing to sacrifice myself for that. And, keyword for Neptune being sacrifice. And we definitely see that in his chart. Now, let's go ahead and talk about, I think it's so funny how his wife calls her profile on like Instagram, she calls it Adventures of a World Traveling Pole Dancing Superhero. And then the name of her Instagram account is Elle's Journey, which, the wife is represented by this Jupiter in Sagittarius. And to me, that is like so Jupiter in Sagittarius, right? Like Adventures of a World Traveling Superhero Pole Dancing and my journey. And even though he's like pretty much stuck in Russia and can't really go anywhere else because he could be nabbed and arrested by the US, she is a free agent and she can travel. She is in a conjunction. His partner is in a conjunction with Uranus. So she's free thinking. She can travel where she wants. She can go where she wants. Yes, she moved to Russia to be with him, but she still like travels around and does her own thing on top of that. So I found that interesting about the partner too. I'm like, yeah, that seems like what she's like. But There's a couple more really important concepts that I would like to talk to you guys about. And the next important concept I would like to talk to you about is the astrology of whistleblowers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Edward Snowden is considered a whistleblower for revealing information about corruption and exposing it to his own personal risk, which is, the definition of a whistleblower. And it got me thinking about, like, what would the astrology be of like a whistleblower? And, I started to think like Jupiter has to be involved there, because Jupiter is the planet of good morals, good ethics, benevolence, wanting everybody to being generous and being moral, and all of that is a very Jupiterian concept. And so I thought Jupiter has to be involved, right? And Jupiter has to be the planet of like whistleblowers. And of course, Edward Snowden has like quite a few, the Jupiter in Sagittarius that we've been talking about, the Neptune in Sagittarius. He has his South Node in Sagittarius, Jupiter stuff. Okay. The ruler of his ascendant is opposite Jupiter, like whistleblowing. Okay. But I cannot like take credit for this, realization, because I was searching the astrology of whistleblowers online, and there is an astrologer named Mandy Lockley from the UK, and there's an article that she wrote online, and I don't know who she is. I just found her article, but it's a really good article, and it's in the Astrological Journal of Great Britain. And I believe she wrote it in 2016, and she wrote an article on whistleblowers. And I was like, aha. And I was like, damn, I wish I could write that article myself. But she wrote it, and I was like, oh shit, it makes a lot of sense. So the first thing that she gave a bunch of different charts of whistleblowers and examples. And right away, she brought up the sign of Sagittarius, having to do with whistleblowers, and Jupiter in general, representing that energy. And I was like, okay, so I was on the right track about, Jupiter ruling over whistleblowers. But she brought up a really interesting concept that I hadn't even thought of. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And in analyzing the chart of like 6 different whistleblowers, she was talking about, let's see, you crack me up sometimes. Dublin. Oh, I was like, he married her. Yeah. Dublin Fitzpatrick. He did marry, his girlfriend. She moved to Russia and he married her. So, yep. And, anyway, so I wasn't even thinking about, so I can't even credit myself with this, revelation, because somebody else had already written an article about it in 2016. But when I saw it, I was like, whoa, eyes are wide open. And what this astrologer was talking about is the galactic center, and the GC, as we call it, the galactic center. And the galactic center is like up in the sky, is actually something. And the galactic center is a black hole in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy. It sits right in the middle there. It's called the galactic center, and it's located at about 26 to 27 degrees Sagittarius. And maybe some of you have heard of the galactic center before. It is an actual thing in the sky, just like, the planets are too. But like, we do have a galactic center. It's located at 26, 27 degrees Sagittarius, and it is a huge black hole in the center of the Milky Way. Okay. And she was talking about how this 26, 27 degrees of Sagittarius is really associated with whistleblowers. And she showed all these different charts, and I was like, aha. And she compared the galactic center to like a big cosmic broom that like sucks everything in and makes it disappear like a black hole does. And if you think about, like whistleblowers in the energy of Sagittarius and Jupiter of, moral, ethical behavior and calling things out and hypocrisy and not liking that, and whistleblowers going after that. You also think about the galactic center, which is in the center of the Milky Way, that is basically, like I said, a big cosmic broom. And think of that as like sucking the corruption out of something. And, it's very interesting because I was like, okay, like my synopsis about Jupiter being the planet of whistleblowers is true. And the galactic center is a huge part of that. And in Edward Snowden's chart, I was like, oh my gosh, if the galactic center is at 26, 27 degrees Sagittarius, then he has Neptune at 27 degrees Sagittarius. He also has his Mars, his Sun, and his North and South node. This whole energy right here, cutting down the middle of his chart, is all aligned with the galactic center. So there is something about his chart about being a whistleblower. And it's not just, the emphasis on Jupiter, but also the emphasis on the galactic center. And I thought that was fascinating, interesting. I found it, yeah. And she wrote in her article, Mandy Lockley wrote in her article, the heart of our galaxy, in the heart of our galaxy is the Milky Way. The galactic center is a supermassive black hole or giant cosmic broom positioned in late Sagittarius, and it is associated with people who spill the beans on organizations and governments. And I was like, what? And I likened it, like I said, to sucking the corruption out of the center of something. And keep in mind that when we're thinking of like Jupiter being the planet of morality and good moral character and ethics and all of that, like we have to think of Jupiter's opposite, which is Saturn. And Saturn, of course, is the teacher of karma. Jupiter is also a teacher, but Jupiter wants to teach us in a loving, caring manner, where Saturn is like, I'm punishing you because you didn't obey the rules, and now I'm going to teach you this karma. And so, and it's very interesting to me because on the day that Edward Snowden was charged with espionage in 2013, Jupiter was in Gemini, and it was on his Sun and North Node. On the day he was charged with espionage, Jupiter was in Gemini on his Sun and North Node conjunction in Gemini. And I was like, what? So, of course, Jupiter is having a huge impact upon Edward Snowden and his whole thing of rising to being a whistleblower and making the personal sacrifice, Sun opposition Neptune, for his beliefs in Sagittarius to bring that information in Gemini and make the ultimate sacrifice. Because he did mention, when he left the United States, he lost everything. He lost all his economic security. He lost his citizenship. His passport was revoked. He had to leave his girlfriend. He couldn't tell her anything because he didn't want to implicate her. He couldn't say goodbye to his family. The guy lost everything. And he did make the comment, if I was just concerned with my comfort and security, I'd still be spying on you from the NSA. Again, his ascendant in a quincunx to the moon in Scorpio. If I cared about my comfort, I would still be spying on you. But obviously, he doesn't place a high regard on his own personal comfort. He places a high value on his beliefs and his morals and what he thinks is right. Okay. And so I find that very interesting. And let's see. Okay, Violet, you've got to catch the end later. And you got to catch, I don't know who Sloan is, Dublin Fitzpatrick. I don't know who that's Sloan. I don't know who Sloan is. But Violet said, I've got to catch you later. Thank you if I've enjoyed this all. Awesome, Violet. Thank you for showing up. And thank you, everyone who's here watching. And so this whole issue of the galactic center and Sagittarius, and he has major personal planets in in alignment with the galactic center. And so, and the Jupiter being on his sun and North Node at the time when the US charged him with espionage. Like, this is it's very interesting stuff, guys. And when we talk about like Jupiter, we can say that life brings us challenging moments, and our ethics and morals that provide us with motivation to do what we need to do in those times where our ethics and morals are challenged. And so that is very much like a Jupiter type of a thinking right there. And so just wanted to point that out. And the galactic center at 27 degrees Sagittarius does have to do with freedom and truth and carrying deep knowledge. He, like with his nodes in a conjunction with that point of the galactic center, it's like it's his fate. It's almost like his fate to carry that very important information at great personal sacrifice, which is, very interesting in the chart. And he makes the ultimate sacrifice for what is right and what he believes, Neptune and Sagittarius. And his whole thing of, I have to be the one to do this. No one else can. And Sun opposite Neptune. I don't care what happens to me. I'll accept the blame. I'll be the martyr. Okay. That's very much like the Sun opposite Neptune. And let's see what else. And I talked about the Neptune South Node in the 7th house with the girlfriend, and how sad she was and lost and confused after he left, and just how she said she was crying on her keyboard. I mean, to me, I was like, wow, that is very much a Neptune K2 type of a thing. And he left her with a lot of tears. Now, he didn't want to tell her because he didn't want to implicate her in it, but he did take these actions. And I don't know if I'm sure he thought about how much it would hurt her. He said he didn't tell her because he didn't want her to be caught up in it, but like, of course it really did hurt her. And her life is very affected by his beliefs, is what we see here as well. Okay. And so he left her out of the loop so she wouldn't get in trouble. And yet she was in deep pain and crying and sad. Neptune K2, very tough stuff there for her. Eventually she joins him in Russia, and they get married and they have 2 babies, but very hard for her. And I also just have to commend the guy for having huge nerves of steel, because Mars Rahu definitely can represent nerves of steel, but literally he walked out of NSA with all that information and knowing what he carried with it, and yet he still did it. Now, varying opinions on, why he did it, or if he's a hero or if he's a traitor. I mean, people have all their different thoughts on that, but you can't really argue with the fact that the guy was extremely brave to do that. Most people wouldn't have the balls to do that. We've got a Sun, Mars, Rahu conjunction, and he's doing it. He's taking that information in Gemini. Like we said, he's taking that information and he is mad about what's going on. So he takes it and he leaves. That's very Mars, Rahu, Sun, and Gemini. And let's see what else, and Mars in Gemini, he's angry about what he's learned about what the government is doing, and he's disillusioned about it. Mars in Gemini opposite Neptune. What's the truth? What should I do? Probably thinking about these things a lot. And anyway, so let's go ahead and, Mars Rahu conjunction in the sign of Gemini also speaks to inserting himself, this Mars Rahu in Gemini, inserting himself in a very dangerous debate about, privacy and international law and freedom and all of that. He's inserting himself in a very dangerous debate, and yet he does it anyway. And, most of us probably wouldn't, I don't know. Most of us, I mean, my beliefs mean a lot to me too, but would I subject myself to being subjected to the Espionage Act of 1917? I don't think so, but like how far and how are you willing to go for that? But it wasn't the first time he did that. As I mentioned, he joined military special forces after 9/11 as well. So we can really see like what he does that way. Now, one question that puzzled me a little bit about his chart, but as I like reviewed it and looked at it, I was like, oh, I get it. Okay. And Sloan is another astrologer. She does both birth charts. You can promote whoever you want, my dear. Don't worry about it. If you're Sloan, I don't know who she is, but it's interesting because that astrologer that made that article about whistleblowers, I didn't know who she was either. I was like, I've never even heard of her, but what an intelligent article. I liked it. And I mean, it's awesome sometimes. Like, there's so many astrologers out there, and all of us are doing, the best work that we can and trying and all of that. But that one article that I found online, I was like, yeah, this is a good article. Me like he. But anyway, so I wanted to like one question that puzzled me as I looked at this chart was, how has he avoided jail time? Because other people, like, he took this information, he flew to Hong Kong, he was supposed to go to Ecuador, but he somehow landed in Russia. He was in the airport for 39 days, but then he got citizenship, and the US wasn't able to extradite him or touch him or bring him home or subject him to jail time. And I was like, let me try to find in his chart where that, because we can look at our chart and say, what is my, like, what are my odds that I might go to jail someday? I mean, it depends on what you're doing in your life, but you could analyze that in a chart. And where would you start to analyze that? You would look at the 12th house, because the 12th house has to do with imprisonment, jail, seclusion, isolation, and, physically going to jail as well. And so I was like, well, let me check out what's going on with this guy, because I want to check out the ruler of his 9th house of like foreign travel, also his 3rd house of just, short journeys for the 3rd house. And the 9th house represents foreign travel. And I also want to look at his 12th house as well and see, how did he manage to avoid going to jail, right? Because I mean, yes, he is very smart and he's like a mercurial person and he's 10 steps ahead of everyone. But how did he manage to avoid jail time? And so, yeah. So it's very interesting because I looked at the ruler of his 3rd. First of all, he has Venus in Leo in his 3rd house of short journeys and travel. Now, because this is a night chart, he's born at night, 4:42 p.m. Sun is below the horizon. Venus is the most benefic planet in this chart. So Venus rules the 12th house of, prisons, isolation, etc., but it's in his 3rd house of travel. It's actually like sweetening up the deal. Like, it's kind of like Venus, a benefic, is kind of helping him along not to get caught. So I see Venus in his 3rd house of travel as a sign that, he's got a little blessing over him as he travels. Also, keep in mind, we mentioned earlier, Mercury is the protector planet for travelers, and he has it in a conjunction with his ascendant. So that's also there too. But let's also take a look at the ruler of his 3rd house of short journeys and travel is in a trine to his 9th house of foreign travel. Okay. And his 9th house is ruled by Saturn. And we find Saturn in the 5th house along with Pluto. And so he himself, his son, is in a trine to his 9th house of foreign travel. And it lands in the 5th house. And the 5th house is, in astrology, the houses that are like most benefic or beautiful or wonderful for individuals is the 9th house and the 5th house. They're both trine houses, and they both represent trines to the ascendant. And so, those are the houses that are most beneficial. So you see the ruler of his ninth house of foreign travel in his fifth house of positive past life credit, and positivity. And you see the ruler of the ninth and the fifth house trine the sun in his first house, which rules the third house. So I'm like, okay, that's why he didn't get caught. Now, he ends up in an environment that is kind of tough. And again, I've never been to Russia, so I don't know. I don't necessarily know how oppressed the people are there. I don't know how bad it is there. But I do know that, some people have written about it being, it's a very cold environment. It can be, the winters are cold and long, and people have mentioned that it can be kind of an oppressive place, but yet he ends up in a Saturn Pluto type of a place, maybe cold, a little bit oppressive, a little bit intimidating, but he survives there just fine. Okay. Sun trine the ruler of his ninth house in a conjunction with Pluto. And in like a diplomatic deal, the sign of Libra being diplomatic deals, in a diplomatic deal with Russia, the ruler of his ninth house of foreign countries and foreign travel in a trine to his sun, his third house, he magically is okay. He ends up in Russia and he ends up getting, permanent citizenship in Russia, and the US government can't touch him. And he also has Venus in his third house of travel, sweetening up the deal. Venus is a benefic, and he's got patron saint of travelers, Mercury, in a conjunction with his ascendant. So I'm like, no wonder he didn't, he hasn't gotten caught. He hasn't gone to jail. Granted, he's not in the most happy, upbeat of places. I mean, I've never been, but I heard, Moscow is a very like, it's like clean and it's very modern and, beautiful buildings and structures. And I mean, I've always been kind of curious about it myself to visit, but like, I don't know much about how the citizens there feel about their country or their government too much. But, it is viewed as kind of a harsher place, or maybe more of a stricter or harsher place. So he ends up, in a Saturn Pluto type of a place, Saturn ruling his ninth house, but it's trine his sun. He's okay. He's okay. He's not arrested. He's not in prison. He's okay. And again, he's a guy who's willing to go through uncomfortable situations in order to stand up for his beliefs. As we mentioned earlier, with his ascendant in a quincunx to the moon in Scorpio, he's willing to endure challenging situations to protect people, to protect the beliefs of others, to protect the privacies of others. Moon in Scorpio, like he's willing to make himself uncomfortable to do that. So when I saw that, I was like, no wonder, like he's in a trine to his ninth house, and his third house is in a trine to his ninth house, and the short journey, by airplane that he took from Hong Kong to Russia, like, well, I don't know if you'd really consider that a short journey, but like the trip that he took, he didn't get to Ecuador. Had he gotten to Ecuador, maybe, because the US was trying to put so much pressure on any ally country that they could to get that country to extradite him. But Russia's like, we're not doing it. Like, we're not going to extradite him. So, he's stuck there, Saturn, Pluto, but he's safe there too, which is a really interesting, interesting, like, conundrum that he has in his life. Like, he can't go home, ascendant quincunx the moon in Scorpio, or he'll be charged. All right. And, his 12th house is in a square to his moon, which would represent, jail or prison. He can't go home, or he could be charged with espionage. But if he stays in Russia, he's fine. Ninth house. Okay. So I found that very interesting. And I'm like, that's why he wasn't, he's in a trine to his ninth house, and this, country protected him. The irony of it is that, during all of his time in the CIA and the NSA, he was taught like Russia's the enemy, like we're going against Russia, but it ends up being this like, dark superpower that, people in the US have always looked at as like, oh, it's this dark superpower, right? It ends up like saving him, which is very much a contradiction. And I think Gemini really does have to do with that contradiction energy of like, ironically, the country that I was like performing, NSA, CIA, like watching of is actually like saving me and housing me. So I found that really interesting too. He can never return home, his ascendant quincunx's moon, but he is safe, at least in Russia. Now, the other thing that I will say is, so he's in a trine to his ninth house of, foreign travel and foreign countries with Pluto. So his way of life completely changes. He has to endure, some hardships, but he's okay. He's in his fifth house. It doesn't take him. He always talked about like, I'm not a partier and I don't need like, I'm an indoor cat. I don't need to party. I don't, very serious guy, Sun trine Saturn in his fifth house, not having a lot of parties, very serious guy. Now, what's interesting to me is that, in this form, he ends up marrying, Libra, the sign of relationships. Because of this, in this foreign country, he ends up marrying his girlfriend and she becomes his wife and they have 2 children. Now, keep in mind the fifth house in astrology right here, this fifth house represents children and he has 2 children. There are 2 planets in the fifth house. Now, this is so funny to me because sometimes I really see this. Sometimes people with 1 planet in the fifth house have 1 child. Sometimes with 2 people, they have 2 planets in the fifth house of children. They have 2 children. Or 3 planets, it's 3 children. So it's just kind of funny to me. But he has 2 planets in the fifth house. He has 2 children. And, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, very tough conjunction, we're going to talk about in a little bit, talks about how although there is this foreign nation, ninth house, that saves him, trine his sun, in the fifth house, his children are going to inherit these Saturn-Pluto issues, and which is restriction. I mean, their mother is a United States citizen, so, and he technically still is too, but one thing I was just grabbed with when I looked at this chart, like Saturn-Pluto in the fifth house, is really the karma that his children are inheriting because of his actions. Now, again, if Edward Snowden is your father and he's stuck in Russia and he can never leave there, that, that's going to do something to a child. And I'm not saying that his, sacrifices aren't worth it, but I also think his children are inheriting this Saturn-Pluto issue of being stuck in Russia and like there and inheriting these tough issues as well as a result of, their father's karma and what their father did. And that was really interesting to me because Edward Snowden had his first child, his son, in December of 2020 when the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was happening in 2020. So not only does he have Saturn and Pluto in the fifth house of children, and I talked about, being in a foreign country, it ruling his fifth house and how like the karma of being there and why he's there because of the parents' decisions and how that may impact his children in the future. He also has a child, a son that was born in 2020 during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020. Now, Saturn-Pluto conjunctions happen once every 30 plus years. And so, it's more unusual to be a person born with Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the reading, Edward Snowden was himself born with this Saturn-Pluto conjunction as he was born during 1983. When in 1982, 1983, there was this Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Now he has a son 30 plus years later who's also born under a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and he has that in his fifth house of children. So I thought that that was really interesting, and how the karma of the father is playing out with the children, which, I mean, it has to be a little heartbreaking for him in a way. Like, he was raised in the US. Edward Snowden was raised in the US, and he really does love the US, at least from how he's talked about it. And the idea that his children, can't be raised in the US, like, he's going to make the best of it. Sun, trine, Saturn, Pluto. I think he'll make the best of it, but there probably is also a bit of a, heartbreak there. Like, I'll never get to go to the US with my own children. If my children go to the US, they'll go with my wife. They will not be going with me. And there has to be like some sadness in that. And then, as I mentioned, his children like sharing in his karma as a result of those decisions. And so I find that interesting. And I find that very challenging for his children, perhaps. And, all the kids that were born in 2020 have that Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And if their parents were born in 1982, 1983, they also have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. But so it's a very interesting configuration as we look at that. Now, before I close Edward Snowden's chart, I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Saturn-Pluto cycles, because they are incredibly fascinating. And if you're born during the time of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, like Edward Snowden does here in the 5th house, or if you're born during the square or during the opposition, okay, you're in a generation of people that have been born with Saturn-Pluto conjunction. But I also think, so to talk a little bit about a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and when we have Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, we can see in the world very bad economic fallout. We can see anything that is threatening is approached with a tightening of control. So if something in society is threatening, it is approached with tightening down on controls. And, we saw that during the 2020, pandemic, when Saturn was making a conjunction with Pluto and Capricorn, and there was restrictive conditions, and there was a shutting down of things, and there was a tightening of control. And we saw that happen. So there's that going on now. So there can also be very bad economic fallout with Saturn-Pluto conjunctions. And we saw that during the pandemic, like the bad economic fallouts. So these Saturn-Pluto cycles are very important, but Saturn and Pluto can also represent an ability to withstand challenging pressure. Even if everything is crumbling around you, you have the ability to withstand this pressure and this willingness to kind of even be uncomfortable at times, maybe for progress or the greater good. And, everybody born in 1982 and 1983 was born at the beginning of a new Saturn-Pluto cycle. And, that's where Edward Snowden was born, 1982, 1983, and 1983. And, Saturn-Pluto was in Libra at the time during this conjunction. And, one thing that really hit people born in the early 80s really, really hard, especially in the sign of Libra, was divorce, and the economic challenges that came with the divorce and the endings of relationships. And it was in the early 80s when we started to see, especially during Pluto and Libra, the Pluto and Libra phase, when people were getting divorced more. And Edward Snowden's parents got divorced when he was younger, and he talks about it as a very painful event of his life. And that whole feeling of, relationships and the pressure on relationships and the economic pressure to stay together. which also happened in 2020, like people having to stay living together or staying together because of economic pressure. In the early 80s, we were going through a very bad recession, which was also happening during this Saturn-Pluto conjunction as well. And then the thing that really like radicalized Edward Snowden to kind of join the military and want to commit himself to service in that way was because of 9/11. Now, 9/11, September 11th, was the Saturn-Pluto opposition. So we started 1982 with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And then on 9/11, there was a Saturn-Pluto opposition. And it was in Gemini and Sagittarius. And interestingly, that Saturn-Pluto opposition hit Edward Snowden's chart right on his ascendant, because that Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2001 in the Saturn-Pluto cycle hit his ascendant point on, because at the time that the Twin Towers fell, Saturn was opposite Pluto. Saturn was in Gemini and Pluto was in Sagittarius, laying right across his ascendant at this 12 degrees Gemini. So Saturn and Pluto on 9/11 were right across Edward Snowden's ascendant, right there. And that event really did, I think, radicalize him in a lot of ways, in saying, you know, I got to do something. I got to fight. I've got to, you know, he went and enlisted in special forces after that, into the military. Like, you know, that kind of started his whole like adventure into things. And, you know, during the Saturn Pluto square, which happened in 2008 to 2011, that's when he was finding out about the corruption within, like, you know, the CIA and the NSA. That's when he started finding out about the corruption. And in 2020, when there was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, he was actually awarded permanent citizenship by Vladimir Putin in Russia during that time too. And he had his first child who has a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So for Edward Snowden, the Saturn-Pluto cycle is a big, big thing. And if you were born in 1982, 1983, then you've got Saturn-Pluto in your chart too, somewhere in your chart. And it also may be affecting you in different ways as well too. So I just wanted to bring up that Saturn, you know, I just wanted to bring up that Saturn-Pluto cycle and that Saturn-Pluto energy, because it is very much a huge like thread in his chart, and also will be in his children's chart as well, especially in his firstborn son. And so I find that to be fascinating in a lot of ways with the Saturn-Pluto cycle. And that whole cycle is fascinating in general. And let me go ahead and let me just close with a couple quotes from Edward Snowden. And keep in mind, Edward Snowden has his sun in Gemini trining Saturn and Pluto in Libra. And he said, he's quoted as saying, these spy programs, like, you know, the spying on the bad guys and the spying in general, that we found out they were just, you know, spying on general Americans. He said these spy programs that have been enabled by NSA and CIA, these programs were never about terrorism. They're about economic spying, social control, and diplomatic manipulation. And, you know, when we talk about social control, Saturn, Pluto, and Libra, okay, Libra being a sign of social, being social, and Saturn, Pluto talking about controlling and social manipulation, and also diplomatic manipulation is another thing he said. Of course, Libra is a sign of the diplomat. And so he's saying these programs that we were using were never about terrorism. They're about economic spying, okay? Saturn, Pluto, economic spying, social control, Saturn and Pluto in Libra, and diplomatic manipulation. Okay. So those words are very much speaking to his Saturn in Pluto in Libra conjunction, those exact words. And he is pointing out Gemini information. He's pointing out these programs had nothing. Now, he was good at creating these programs. He created, several of the programs, but he became disillusioned, Sun opposite Neptune, by what he was seeing. And he said these programs were never about fighting terrorism like he originally wanted to do. These were about diplomatic manipulation, which, Saturn, Pluto, and Libra. Okay. So I think that is fascinating. That quote is, to me, and it's funny, Dublin Fitzpatrick, because he, has so many quotes out there and he's very verbose. He's got Mercury in Gemini, so lots of quotes from him. And he also said, I don't see myself as a hero. Okay. Sun, Rahu, Mars conjunction. I don't see myself as a hero. I'm acting in self-interest. Okay. Sun, Rahu, Mars in the first house. I'm acting in self-interest. I don't want to live in a world without privacy. Moon in Scorpio. I don't want to live in a world without privacy. And the very last quote that I am going to leave you guys with, which I think is quite interesting, is where he says, I would rather be without a state or a country, like not belong to any state or country, than to be without a voice. Mercury in Gemini, my voice, what I have to say, what I have to share. Opposite Jupiter in Sagittarius, country, where you live, your political affiliation, your especially Jupiter in Sagittarius with the United States too, because the United States has such a Sagittarian vibe to it. But I would rather retain my voice than retain my passport. I would rather be stuck not being able to travel, ruler of my ascendant opposite Jupiter. I can't travel. I would rather be stuck without any of that than lose my ability to share my voice based on what I'm seeing. And so he clearly was, wanting to make those risks. He clearly did them and he clearly went after it. And now we can have a much wider discussion about privacy and much wider public debate about that. And he did say he wasn't trying to necessarily be the agent that changes everything, more than he was trying to give people something to think about, to make up their own mind on. And that is very, again, Mercury in Gemini. Now, I'm just giving you something to think about and to draw your conclusions from. And so that is what I have for this reading on Edward Snowden. I hope that you guys enjoyed the reading. I hope that it was informative, educational, etc. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your feedback. Take care now. Bye-bye.